Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're stepping into a completely fascinating and honestly highly debated cultural conversation. We're going to be unpacking a distinctly opinionated piece by commentator Bridget Fetisi, which dives headfirst into what she calls the pride fatigue phenomenon. We're going to break down the source material's claims about a recent cultural backlash, looking closely at how the text connects public polling data, corporate policy, and the really messy complexities of modern identity politics. Now remember, our goal here isn't to take a side. We're just here to impartially map out exactly what the source is arguing, how it builds its case, and why it matters to our understanding of the broader cultural shifts happening right outside our doors. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the pride fatigue phenomenon. Second, the core of the backlash. Third, culture wars and baseball caps. And finally, California's diversity contracts. All right, part one, the pride fatigue phenomenon. We're analyzing the shift in public opinion data. So where does this whole argument start? Well, the source grounds its entire premise in some recent, pretty striking Gallup poll data. Look at this. We're talking about a really steep decline in Republican support for gay marriage. It dropped from a high of 55% back in 2022 all the way down to 37% today. That's an 18-point plummet, and the host uses this exact drop as the foundation for the whole explainer. The idea here is that a major cultural regression, or at least a very real shift in sentiment, is absolutely underway. But it's actually not just one political party making this shift. When you dig into the wider demographic breakdown, the source points out that support among independents has demonstrably dropped off too. Meanwhile, Democratic support, that stayed exactly the same. By laying out these specific data points, the source really sets up its central question. Why is this specific decline happening right now, especially after years of steady cultural acceptance? Moving on to Section 2, the core of the backlash, let's look at the theoretical roots of pride fatigue. Now, you've probably heard the mainstream media's take on this Gallup data, right? They usually blame the decline on conservative leaders pushing back against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. But our source today completely rejects that idea. Instead, she argues this backlash is a direct reaction to what she calls the overreach of trans activism, specifically pointing to the inclusion of children in gender ideology. Her argument is basically that the public isn't rejecting fundamental LGBTQ rights, they're rebelling against a newer, very specific set of cultural demands. To back this up, the source brings in a quote from a really prominent LGBTQ writer, Andrew Sullivan. He argues that trying to include children in gender ideology has fundamentally changed the debate. The source uses this to make a heavy claim that by focusing on children, modern activism is actually inadvertently re-energizing some of the oldest, most damaging homophobic tropes out there. It's a bold claim, but it's her way of explaining that sudden plunge in the Gallup polls we just looked at. To prove this so-called cultural overreach is a real thing, the source fires off a rapid-fire list of corporate actions. We're talking Target's tuck-friendly swimwear, a pre-K book called Pride Puppy that literally introduces words like intersex and leather, Skittles completely draining the color from their candy for pride, the CDC putting out guidance on induced chest feeding for men using experimental drugs, and, you guessed it, the massive Bud Light Dylan Mulvaney campaign. By piling up these flashpoints, the text argues that everyday people feel like they can't opt out of this ideology anymore, and that's what's leading to this widespread fatigue. And according to our host, corporations are finally waking up to this. She shares a personal observation of walking right into a Target store and noticing that all that pervasive pride merchandise from past years, it was completely gone, replaced by red, white, and blue patriotic displays. For her, this visual swap in retail strategy is undeniable proof of cause and effect. It's evidence that companies are scrambling to dial back their messaging because they are absolutely terrified of alienating their broader consumer base. Which brings us to Section 3, Culture Wars and Baseball Caps, from MLB controversies to historical riots. So, pivoting from these massive cultural trends, the source zooms in on a really fascinating microcosm happening in Major League Baseball. 3 MLB players actually received official warnings from the league. Why? Because they took a pen and wrote Genesis 9:12-16 on their mandated Pride Night baseball caps. If you don't know it, that specific Bible verse is where God describes the rainbow as a sign of his covenant with the earth. The host frames this as an active, deliberate rebellion, these players trying to reclaim the rainbow symbol from a forced corporate event. What's genuinely super interesting here is how the source lines up 2 completely different voices who actually end up agreeing. On one side, conservative commentator Kira Davis argues that pride is all about sex and just doesn't belong in sports. But then, in stark contrast, you have Dan Savage, a very prominent gay columnist and activist, basically pleading with the league to stop forcing athletes to wear rainbow gear, saying it's not helping. The source uses this totally rare cross-political agreement to argue that, hey, mandating corporate pride apparel is actually getting pretty unpopular across the entire political spectrum. Okay, to prove a broader point about these apparel controversies, the source takes us on this incredibly bizarre, kind of hilarious historical detour. It turns out Americans have literally always fought violently over hats. She brings up the 1922 straw hat riot in New York. Back then, society dictated you could only wear a straw hat from May 15th to September 15th. But on September 13th, some impatient teenagers started attacking people who were wearing them a couple days early. This actually escalated into 8 full days of rioting, with mobs of 1,000 people running around the city, snatching and destroying hats. And you literally can't make this up. The source points out this incredibly ironic detail. The longest recorded jail sentence handed down for this hat riot was delivered by a judge named Magistrate Peter A. Hatting. Yes, Judge Hatting. It's this fantastic moment of source-derived levity that just perfectly illustrates how totally absurd our cultural battles over apparel can get, whether we're talking about an MLB Pride cap today or a straw boater from the 1920s. All right, final section, Part 4, California's diversity contracts, bureaucratic policies, and identity verification. Here, the source shifts our focus to an absolutely staggering number, $633 million. According to the text, this is the massive chunk of public utility contracts that California is pressuring its utilities to award specifically to diversity-certified businesses. It's a ton of public money, right? But it introduces a really sticky bureaucratic hurdle. How does a business actually prove its diversity status to get a piece of that funding? Well, the source outlines California's official state certification program. And honestly, it reads like something straight out of a sitcom. To legally prove your sexual orientation for these contracts, the state accepts 3 highly bureaucratic methods. Number 1, a formal letter from an LGBT organization. Number 2, actual proof that a newspaper once explicitly identified you as gay. Or number 3, which the host points out as the most absurd, 3 letters from personal contacts literally printed on official company letterhead, formally attesting to your sexual orientation. And the stakes for navigating this bureaucratic maze are no joke. Citing reporting by journalist Christopher Rufo, the source notes that if an applicant commits fraud, meaning if you fake your sexual orientation just to grab a slice of that $633 million pie, the penalty is intense. You can face up to 1 full year in a county jail. It really highlights a staggering irony here. A state government legally requiring you to provide documented, formalized proof of your sexuality just so you can do business. Which brings us to the end of our explainer and really to the core tension driving this entire source text. From those shifting Gallup polls and the changing merchandise at Target to MLB hat controversies and a highly formalized state-run gay certification program, we are witnessing a massive cultural stress test. The source's ultimate argument is that we've pushed past mere acceptance and into an era of forced compliance and bureaucratic overreach. So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. As corporate policy and identity politics continue to crash into each other, where exactly is the line between genuine inclusion and bureaucratic overreach? Thanks for diving into this explainer with me, and keep asking the big questions.